we're going to have our first keynoter come out, and his name is Danny Windham. He's the CEO of Digium. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background. Somewhere around 2004 or so, I became aware of the concept of Asterisk, and I learned that this new open source PBX company was being created, and it had the potential, from my perspective, to really change telecom. And how many people here, just out of curiosity, are curious about Asterisk and Digium or use the products? Wow, that's about 65%. That's a good number. So I was blown away back in 2004 because I realized the potential for Asterisk to change communications just the way open source and Linux changed computing. And as it turns out, it's been a huge force. And that's why we're really, really happy to have Danny here. We also have a co-located Digium Asterisk world as part of ITEXPO because we want to make sure that you can learn about everything having to do with that topic at the show. And with that, I've known Danny for at least 4 or 5 years now. He formerly was with Adtran, and both Adtran and Digium are located in Huntsville, Alabama. Nice place. Really tough to get to, but once you get there, nice place, nice people. And I've watched the company grow. I've watched them break ground on a new headquarters. I watched them fill the new headquarters. And I've watched them become a dominant force in the communication space. And that's why I find it really important to hear his perspective and get his thoughts on where communications is heading. So with that, please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Thanks.
Welcome. Certainly good to see all of you here today. Thanks for you coming out this afternoon. It's quite an honor for me to be kicking off the Keynote series here at ITEXPO, but I noticed that Rich left off one reason of why you might have come to ITEXPO. So how many of you checked the weather forecast in your hometown, the weather forecast at South Beach, and then said, that ITEXPO show sounds like a pretty good idea? Yeah, that's exactly what I thought. Same for us, by the way. I can't imagine a better place to be this week, considering that the rest of the country is in the deep freeze, than right here at South Beach and at ITEXPO. I am Danny Windham. I'm CEO of Digium, and for those of you who don't know Digium, we are a privately held company in Huntsville, Alabama, which, by the way, totally explains why I talk this way. And we are best known for being the creator, the maintainer, and the sponsor of the open source communications project known as Asterisk. Now, being in the open source project space has really had us in the middle of the open source migration of the last few years. And so we have lived and grown up with what's happened in the open source world. In fact, over the last 10 years, I suspect open source has transitioned from something that 10 years ago was a very scary proposition for an corporate IT manager to something today that's relatively mainstream. And with that, we have seen all sorts of new applications being adopted. But still, in many cases, those applications are serving some relatively niche application inside of an IT infrastructure. And what I want to talk about today is, can we really run our businesses on open source software? I'm not talking about in a niche here and there. I'm talking about predominantly running our business on open source. And I'm not talking about non-mission critical applications. I'm talking about the most demanding, most mission critical applications you have in your company. Now, I'm a guy that normally likes to jump straight to the bottom line, so I'm going to go ahead and answer the question. Yes, we can. Any questions? No, okay, I'm kidding. That's clearly my opinion, but I'd like to take the next few minutes and see if I can convince you that it should be your opinion as well. I guess before we spend time trying to understand if we can run our company on open source software, we should at least ask the question of why we'd want to do that. And in fact, Gartner studied this question, and the #1 response that came back from the respondents was they do this because they want to save money. In fact, the Standish Group produced a report that estimated that the adoption of open source software can account for about $60 billion in savings by IT users across the world. The #2 reason that was reported is protection from a particular vendor, quote, owning your IT infrastructure. And the third reason was the ease of customization. I had the distinct pleasure of spending some time with Mark Penn last week. Mark is the author of a book called Microtrends. And Mark's premise is that our economy is being driven by hundreds of small microtrends as opposed to one or two large megatrends. And part of what's driving those microtrends is the concept of personalization and customization. And what's driving that concept is the fact that the internet has enabled people with like interests to find themselves and create demand for these types of like interest. In fact, if you can put 1 million people together with a similar interest, that's a reasonable sized market, even though it's only 1/3 of 1% of the people that live in the United States. Open source is the tool that enables those trends to permeate into business. Being able to customize your IT infrastructure to run your business the way you want to run it is possible in the advent of the open source era. So I believe open source has been the victim of fear, uncertainty, and doubt over the last few years, maybe at the hands of proprietary software application developers. So maybe it's worth us just doing a level set of what is open source, what's the current status of adoption in the market, and what are the different types of open source. So for a moment, let's just study that. Open source is computer software that is available in source code form. It's normally delivered under a license that permits the user to study, change, improve, or customize the software for their use. It's often developed in a very public, collaborative, and transparent manner. And some open source software is licensed in a fashion that meets the requirements of a thing called the open source definition. Well, what is the open source definition? It's a series of requirements published by the Open Source Initiative that says if software can meet this set of requirements, you can call it open source. So if the license under which the software is distributed requires that the source code be made available to the end user, if it demands that the license terms apply to everyone, if it permits the creation of derivative works, if it requires free redistribution, this is free as in speech, if it doesn't restrict other software that's used with, and if it is not discriminatory in the terms of the technology to which it's applied, or the field of use, or the groups, or the users, it can meet the definition of the open source definition and can be considered open source software. So today you'll hear terms like FOSS, which is free and open source software. That is the traditional open source we think of, and it is software that's distributed where the source code is freely available, and the license terms meet the open source definition. However, in the last few years, there has been an explosion in the area of commercial open source. So commercial open source normally embodies some form of free and open source under terms that are somehow restricted by some sort of a commercial license agreement. You might have heard of the, quote, freemium business model. If an organization is willing to give you some level of functionality for free in exchange for having the opportunity to charge you for some premium level of functionality, that most likely involves distributing some free and open source software distributed under an open source license in combination with software that's distributed under a commercial license, so they have mixed source applications, and that typically turns out to be commercial open source. You might also hear a term called dual license model. In a dual license model, that is where software is available and licensed under an open source license, but it's also licensed under a commercial license. And the difference being not the software itself, but the entitlements and the requirements of the license agreement. You might hear people say that's an open source company. In fact, Digium refers to ourselves as an open source company, and we're actually happy about that. But open source is not a business model. Open source is a development model. It describes how a product can be developed among peers all over the world in a collaborative and transparent fashion. And it can be a marketing model. So that organization with a freemium business model might use the availability of their free software to try to create demand for their for-pay products or services. Just think of it as a high-tech version of the razor and razor blades philosophy. You give away something very valuable in hopes of being able to sell something that either makes that project more valuable or more useful to the end user. And in the world of software applications, today there is an opportunity for a particular software open source project to become the de facto standard when competing with proprietary alternatives. Clearly today, Linux is the de facto standard for an open source operating system. And in fact, we needed open source operating systems to be stable and broadly deployed so we could see the proliferation of open source applications. But today, we see the proliferation of open source applications, and there are a number of them that today have the status of being the de facto standard in their particular area, and some of them have achieved either leading market share or at least very impressive market share numbers. Today, we think that Linux operates or is responsible for maybe 21% or so of the server operating system market, that Firefox is responsible for more than 20% of the web browser market, and Apache is responsible for almost 2/3 of the web server market, which is clearly a market-leading stat, as well as Asterisk has been estimated to be responsible for maybe 18% of the new voice-over IP endpoints that were installed in a prior year. We have really reached a phase where for almost any software application that you can dream up, there is an open source alternative to your proprietary solution. There are operating system open source solutions, there are client-side solutions, there are server-side solutions. There are front-end systems, there are back-end systems. And there are applications for almost anything you can imagine. ERP systems, networking, database engines, voice-over IP solutions. We've really reached a spot where in the open source world, there's an app for that. So if we have all the software available, who's using it? Well, Gartner suggests that organizations of all sizes are adopting open source software. And it's not just small or large organizations. It is organizations that focus on different industry segments. And it's not just non-mission critical applications, it's mission critical applications as well. The adoption of open source software is not being constrained by any geographical boundary. In fact, Forrester suggests that the adoption of open source in Europe is slightly ahead of pace of the adoption of open source in North America. They suggest that maybe it's because the Europeans have a little more sense of community and open source is more embraced there. I don't know. I did notice that the sense of community resulted in a $800 million set of fines levied against Microsoft for antitrust violations. But you will note that open source today is being used by some of the world's largest and most successful organizations. But you're maybe more interested in knowing that open source is being used by Zynga. So Zynga is the company that is behind Farmville, and Fishville, and Mafia Wars. And you might think, well, that's a silly application. Except that Kleiner Perkins says that Zynga is the company that has been the fastest growing and the most profitable of any company they have ever invested in. In 3 years, they've gone from 0 to 320 million users, an estimated $500 million in revenue, and a guess of about a $5 billion market cap. And why that's interesting is Zynga's products are all based using open source. So, while gaming applications at least might be interesting, maybe we should look at some real-world examples because that's probably more why you're here today. And one of the very cool things about open source is we talk about it being free as in speech, but most of the time it's also free as in beer. And so if you can get it for free, open source penetrates applications that proprietary solutions normally never get adopted into. One case in point is after the devastating earthquake in Haiti of January of 2010, a humanitarian project was stood up. The name of the project is the Relais Amway. And in fact, if your Haitian Creole is better than mine, you may feel free to correct my pronunciation. But in less than a week, a group of people put together a communication systems based on open source communications and open source voice recognition and stood up a system that allowed the people of Haiti to call into a system in their own native language and access emergency services. So the result is, these people were able to quickly get access to help that otherwise would have been unavailable to them. In a similar vein, not-for-profit organizations are adopting open source en masse. And once again, it's because open source is free as in beer. And people all over the world are willing to use their talent and their time to produce solutions. One company, Invenio, set out to try to address the challenge that over 1 billion people on our planet lack access to clean water and sanitation and communications infrastructure. And so, using open source software and solar-powered PCs, they have put together a communication system and a basic computing system to go into villages in need. And the result there has been, in many cases, really the difference in life and death. Getting access to medical services and access to educational services and understanding what they should be doing to improve their crops have really allowed them to improve the quality of life as a result of these systems being installed. And while those two case studies, I think, are particularly meaningful in terms of the fact that they're making the world a better place, I would guess most of you are here because your interest is trying to make your company a better place. And so let's take some specific company examples from small, medium, and large type organizations of how companies are using open source and benefiting from open source. And I couldn't come up with a better case study for a small, medium-sized business than Digium. The question here is, can you lower the cost of running the IT infrastructure of a small to mid-sized company by using predominantly open source software? Well, as it turns out, yes you can. Digium is doing it today. Now, we are an open source company, but inside of our IT department, we do not have an open source edict. We have an open source preference, which says we want to always use the best tool for the job, and all things equal, we'll choose an open source solution, but we don't only consider open source solutions. While we haven't done an official study to figure out exactly how much money we've saved, my educated guess is we've saved hundreds of thousands of dollars in an organization our size by embracing an open source IT infrastructure concept. So if you look at how we're using open source, within Digium today, the most popular open operating system is Linux. The most popular web browser is Firefox. The most popular productivity suite is OpenOffice. We run the entire company on an open source collaboration tool from Zimbra. And if we haven't crossed over, we're close to crossing over where Android is the most used mobile operating system. But that's just on the desktop. If we get into the IT infrastructure, our website, the front-end systems and the back-end systems are built on open source. Our chat server runs on open source. We have a business intelligence tool. We have a knowledge base that all run on open source. We use open source to document and monitor the health of Digium's network. But the spot where we maybe use the highest percentage of open source is in our engineering and development groups. So we use open source tools and software to help design, develop, manage, monitor, maintain, and track all of the Digium products. In fact, we use open source scripting software languages to make us more efficient in writing open source software. So we really have embraced open source. Now, do we have any proprietary software in our company? We do. I can't say that we don't, but it is the exception, not the norm. So if you can run a medium-sized business using open source software, can you run an enterprise class organization using open source software? Well, turns out the answer is yes, you can, because the London Stock Exchange is doing it today. The operators of the London Stock Exchange were using a commercial product called TradeElect. It is based on Microsoft.NET platform, and the price tag for them was in the range of $65 million. They commissioned, in fact, the cost savings for the London Stock Exchange, the opportunity was so significant, it allowed them to go out and buy a software consulting company who they commissioned to write an open source alternative using Linux and open source software, install it. Today they're running their trading engine using this open source alternative, and they suggest that they are saving £10 million per year in doing so. Not only that, but today changes to the system is in their power, and the performance of the system has improved. They claim that trades once took 2.7 milliseconds to execute, now take less than half of a millisecond to execute. So, if you could run a large enterprise on open source software, could you run a city on open source software? Well, as it turns out, yes you can. Because the City of Amsterdam is running on open source software today. The City of Amsterdam set out to try to transition as many applications as practical from proprietary to open source alternatives. And they identified Linux as an alternative to Windows, and Zimbra as an alternative to Microsoft Outlook, and OpenOffice as an alternative to Microsoft Office, and an Asterisk-based PBX as an alternative to their Siemens PBX. And today they're in the implementation phases of this project and rolling this out to something on the order of a little less than 30,000 desktops, and believe they are saving millions of euros a year in doing so. So, if you could run a city on open source software, could you run a whole island on open source software? Well, turns out, yes you can, because the island of Nui is running on open source software today. Now, Nui is a little bitty island in the South Pacific, and it is a long way from anywhere. And they do not have a GSM operator. And communications on the island for the inhabitants was difficult. So they brought in a set of consultants who created and implemented and installed a system for them using open source software and off-the-shelf hardware. And today, they gave all the inhabitants a mobile phone and built a open source wireless switching infrastructure, and now any inhabitant on the island can call any other inhabitant on the island, and has improved communications for them. And in fact, since it's built on off-the-shelf hardware and open source software, and because they have the source code, one of their concerns is what happens in the case of a disaster, because they are in the South Pacific after all, and hurricanes come through. In the case of a hurricane, they can easily replace the system. So, if you can run an island on open source software, could you run a whole country on open source software? Well, turns out, yes you can. So the Malaysian government today is running predominantly on open source software. They set out a few years ago to convert 30% of the agencies that use desktop applications and 80% of the agencies that were using back-end applications to an open source alternative. And, to their surprise, ahead of their schedule, by 2010, 97% of the agencies had converted all or some of their infrastructure to an open source alternative. And they're not the only countries considering this. In late 2010, Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin decreed that the entire federal bodies and agencies within Russia were to convert to open source alternatives by the year 2015. So how's that working for them? I don't know. Time will tell. And they're not the only government who's looking at this. In fact, there is a movement in the United States that believes the U.S. government should be doing a very similar thing. The Open Source for America group is an industry group that's advocating open source adoption within the U.S. government. It will be interesting to see what their success is over the next few years. So, if you can run a humanitarian project and a not-for-profit and a small business and a medium-sized business and a large business and a city and an island and a country on open source software, I think you can run your business on open source software too. But how do you make an informed decision about whether that's a good cost investment for you? Well, if it's open source and it's free as in beer, does it not cost anything? Well, that's ridiculous, because we ought to be thinking in terms of total cost of ownership. And the thing we talk about for free software is acquisition cost. And total cost of ownership includes things outside of acquisition cost. It includes hardware cost. It includes training cost and maintenance fees and support cost and system administration cost. So how do you construct a problem to understand if open source software is for you? Well, the use of open source software typically eliminates the software acquisition cost. It might reduce the hardware cost because you're typically running on commercial off-the-shelf hardware, which usually is cheaper than proprietary software. It might eliminate the traditional maintenance and support cost. But it's going to increase your internal administrative and development cost, and it might increase your training cost. So if that's sort of the structure, where is open source ideally suited? Well, it's ideally suited for organizations that have in-house technical expertise. That would include technology companies of all sizes, enterprises, universities, government agencies, etc. It's also very well suited to replace proprietary applications which come with per user fees where there are lots of users. So, if your organization doesn't fit that profile, does that mean that free and open source software is not for you? No. This is where the explosion in commercial open source has come from over the last few years. There are a number of organizations out there that produce a commercial derivative of a free and open source project for people who don't have the degree of in-house expertise or want to spend their expertise solving a free and open source problem. In Digium's case, we produce Asterisk, which is an open source project that you can take and use for free if you want to go build your own PBX. We also package a small and medium-sized business IP PBX into a product called SwitchFox that we sell. And so, in our case, you have choices between free and open source or commercial open source. If you're trying to figure out for your organization what makes the most sense, it's virtually impossible to produce an analysis with dollars in it that can be generically applied into any application in any organization. And so what you need to do is to be able to frame how you think about the problem and do a total cost of ownership analysis on any particular project that you are considering. Within Digium, our experience has been that typically proprietary alternatives are the most expensive. And whether free and open source or commercial open source is your best alternative depends upon your organization. What are your internal core competencies? Where are you willing to spend your resources? What's your existing infrastructure? What are your goals and plans? So only you can do the TCO for a particular project within your company, but this maybe help you understand how to frame the problem. So for organizations that have gotten on the open source train, Gartner surveyed them and said, what do you wish you had done differently when you started? And the two most common answers were, number one, we wish we had spent more energy trying to understand open source licensing before we started. And number two, we wish we had built a policy from which we would deploy open source in our organization before we started. So if you're looking to try to overcome those two specific issues, what do you do? Well, first, with regard to the licensing issue, go take a look at what the common open source licenses are. There are 7 of them that make up 85% of the market, and the GPL version 2 is about half of the market itself. And when you want to understand what the restrictions and the regulations of an open source license, whichever license that restriction is, there are online resources for you to go use to be able to understand that. OpenSource.org, GNU.org, all have online resources to help. Today, there are lawyers who specialize in open source licensing. There are even companies who specialize in open source licensing. Protocode is a company that specializes in open source licensing, and they make an online tool available that is a comparison of popular open source licenses. One thing to note is if you're going to use a project inside your company, the restrictions are significantly different than if you're going to distribute that software outside your company. With regard to lack of policy, Gartner says, create a policy, adhere to it, train people inside the company on it. In developing any open source project, use tools to help track and monitor your source code portfolio. And then when you finish the project, go see if you complied with your own policy. So, if you're looking to get on the open source train, then our recommendations to you are, 1, dive in to figure out what model is most appropriate for your company. 2, spend some time to understand licensing. 3, develop a policy and use it to deploy open source software in your company. Spend time to understand and assess any project that you are considering deploying inside your company in terms of the structure of the project, the maturity of the project, what its long-term viability is, how many developers are associated with it, what the commercial support model is. And then if you find yourself in need of expertise, don't be afraid to embrace commercial open source options for products and services to augment your internal in-house skill and expertise. So if you do these things, will you be able to completely run your business on predominantly open source software? The answer is yes, you can, because we're doing it at Digium. Thanks.